So I have gone on record for 2 years calling attention to the problem of escalating costs in the PERS system, in the PERS fund, the increasing unfunded liability and the effect that it has on draining resources from employers, which are in this state are state agencies, local governments, and schools. Local governments meaning special districts in many cases, and port authorities, but also cities and counties. The combined impact over the last couple of years has been enormous, and the increase in cost alone of only the employer contributions, so none of the bonds or any of the other things that are out there that are a little obscure but are part of the cost of that pension. But the increase of just taking money directly from employers and putting it into the PERS fund was $1 billion last budget cycle, and it's almost $1 billion, projected to be another $1 billion this time. And we know that it will increase again in the subsequent budget cycle. And those are resources that we could have available for classrooms, for public safety, for any number of services that are priorities for just about everybody in the state. So what can we do about it? I also have introduced a couple of bills that provide, I think, what I would characterize as sort of common sense adjustments to the system. They're not fundamental reforms in the sense of, let's get rid of the pension system and go to a 401k-like program or something like that. They were reforms aimed at reducing the unfunded liability. So for example, capping cost of living increases. They're already capped, but capping them at the average benefit for PERS retirees, meaning that you get a COLA up to the average benefit. If you receive benefits above that, the benefits above are not subject to a COLA. Just doing that, because it affects a lot of retirees and future retirees, and it affects a long, long period of time for the fund, reduces the cost to the system by over $500 million per budget cycle. So that's just by doing that, $500 million magically appears back in the accounts of state employers, so state agencies and schools. That's not even including the impact on local governments. There are a couple of things we can do like that would have profound effects now on the availability of money to run our government, and I am on record, will continue to push this issue. Unfortunately, it's very political. It shouldn't be. It should be a rational policy discussion, because the benefit flows not just to the state and to the services, but to public employees, because if we promised them a pension, we have to have a system that we can actually afford to fund to provide the pension that we promised. So there's a real need to make the PERS, the whole pension system, more sustainable. And again, I'm on record as to what reforms I would support.
Certainly a significant issue. I think that we need to be, I'll say right up front, open to PERS reform, particularly reform that makes the fund sustainable. So I do think we need to be open to reform. Most particularly, I would say that when you see PERS recipients that make over $100,000 a year in retirement, that are like the Pilate cakes that people like to point to, that those are fairly outrageous benefits. Any reform that we look at, though, I think it's important that first of all, it has to be reform that would actually save money and strengthen the fund. Some of the ideas that have been kicked around wouldn't necessarily save any money. Secondly, they have to be reforms that would be constitutional, that would be legal. Otherwise, we're inviting further futile litigation. We've already gone several rounds on that count. Third, it would have to be reform that's fair. These are benefits that have been arrived at through meticulous, I know firsthand, careful contract bargaining negotiation sessions in exchange for other areas that were traded off and so forth. So they'd have to save us money, they'd have to be constitutional and legal, and they'd have to be fair. That having been said, before we dive in and start talking about solutions to a problem, an unfunded liability, I think we have to be clear about what the problem is, before we talk about solutions. What's the problem? The problem, the gap, the unfunded liability, wasn't created by teachers, policemen, firemen, justice workers, health workers. The problem was created by Wall Street shenanigans and the crash of the larger stock market, largely because of deregulation. So to turn around and say, now we're going to look for a solution to a problem that we're mischaracterizing on the backs of working people is setting up sort of a straw man. Secondly, a lot of the solutions have already been put in place in reforms that were both, I think it was 96 and in 2003. A lot of those hard decisions and reforms have been made, and we need to give those reforms time to work. For instance, the average PERS recipient retiring today earns a pension of around $32,000 a year. It's about $2,600 a month. That's the average public employee on PERS retiring today. Most people, I think, when they hear $2,600 a month, are not going to think that that's an extravagant pension benefit that needs to be reformed. Now, I've said that I'm open to reform. I know that there is an impact, as Jason has implied, to the entities that have to pay into the fund. But I just think we have to be very, very careful about how we go about doing that, about how we look at the problem. Once again, let's go back into the past, not repeat some of the very same mistakes. Before we look at solutions, let's look at what caused the problem. And we have to make sure that any reform we consider, again, is constitutional, that it actually saves us money, and that it is fair.
So I've gone on record, and actually I've introduced bills supporting probably kind of in two buckets: cost savings and fairness sort of reforms. And the cost savings, I mentioned COLAs, there are a couple others that combined would save about $1 billion per budget cycle. So I've gone on record, I've done the research, I've done the work to say what needs to be done to save money so that we can keep our schools open in this state. And on the fairness side, it would be things like getting legislators out of PERS. I declined to take PERS because I think it's difficult to choose to take up this issue and to have signed up as a legislator when you're a decision maker about those reforms. I think it's better to stay out of it. I'm aware that many other legislators have opted out of it, some have not. I really don't care, but I think that the decision makers about PERS should not be PERS recipients. Not on the PERS board, by the way, but in the legislature. So those are kind of the fairness ideas. The thing that, so Nathan rattled on for a while and blamed Wall Street, which I think, I really, I don't think we should repeat mistakes of the past in the sense of wasting our time. I think what we have to do is we have to look at the problem that we're presented with and what's the right way to deal with it. Again, I'm not afraid to put out the ideas that I have. I'm not afraid to listen to other ideas. But the reality is, in the last couple of years, this policy that exists, this pension plan, is structured in such a way that it is costing us statewide over $3 billion. And it's money we can't really afford to put in, not to apply to service system, but to use to pay down unfunded liability. There are ways that we can do that. We can't, this state is not going to suddenly go back and collect the money from Wall Street. I don't even know what Nathan's implying there. But the bottom line is, avoiding the question is not the right thing to do, and making it more political than it already is not the right thing to do, nor is blaming public employees. Public employees take the system that we have given them as a state government, and they live with it. It's their compensation system. It's certainly not their fault. It's the legislature's fault. And so now, what are you going to do about it? I mean, what would you do?
Okay, as far as politicizing the issue, because Jason alluded to that a couple of times, it's not my side that has brought up PERS ad nauseum for the past 2 years, and it has made it a political issue. It's the campaigns of my opponent and his colleagues and his party that have made this a political issue. as well as the local paper. In a political context, it wasn't my side that made it a political issue. Secondly, you're not doing, Jason mentioned that, you know, reforming PERS, reform is a nice euphemism there, but in order to help schools and kids and so forth, I'm interested in that as well. But the fact is, you're not doing teachers a favor by cutting their pensions. You're not going to attract more excellent professionals to the teaching profession by cutting their pensions. And yes, it is germane that we look at what's the nature of the problem, where did it come from, before we look at solutions. So Jason mentioned the difficulty in getting money from Wall Street. Well, it's not going to be easier to get money from public employees or less impactful. As far as the issue that Jason referred to as PERS for legislators, I can't imagine that people go into the legislature, or in my case, aspire to be a state legislator for the financial benefits. I think Jason would be the first to say that there's not a whole heck of a lot of reward financially to being a state legislator. And PERS benefits are a reflection of that as well. They're not very substantial. Finally, I would say that the PERS account was solvent. Indeed, it was more than 100% funded prior to the market crash. Reforms have been put in place to return it to solvency. They are working. We need to give them some time to work. I am open to further reform. I think we need to be. But the fact is that the fund was funded over 100% prior to the market crash. It's funded now at 80-some% and recovered.